Okay, so like many, during the COVID times, we thought, what can we actually do to actually help in a small way? As a business intelligence software vendor, we thought, why don't we get some data together on the COVID disease and allow people to track that information by continent, by country, over time to see how things are developing. So we thought we would actually use this also as a case study for perhaps your projects. A lot of the time when we're doing case studies, it's quite difficult because it's difficult to share information from the particular customer. But of course here we're using public domain information. So we thought we could go through this and use this as the sort of things that you can hopefully see as lessons and best practices when approaching your project using data that everyone knows, the COVID data. So like every project, we have to go through certain standard things. What are the requirements? Why are we doing this in the first place? And where is the information coming from? Now, a lot of the time, the information can't come from one place. You'd think perhaps with COVID it could, but actually it turned out that we had to use two data sources to give us the types of information and presentation that we wanted to convey in the dashboards. And of course, as soon as you have more than one data source, you're immediately into integration. Very simple level. How can I be sure that I'm comparing like with like when I'm taking data from one source and then comparing it with another? And that has a whole raft of knock-ons with things like data integrity. Are we reporting the same things from the different data sources? Are they actually called the same things? A very simple example I'll use later on is in one data source, America was called the USA. In another data source, it was called the US. But of course, that is the same information. Now, if I'm looking at data coming in from both and I just say, give me the US, then I'll only have half the data. Likewise, if I give the USA. So how do we handle that when we're not in control of the information? If we're in control of the source file, we'd obviously code it up to be USA only, but we're not. So how do we do that and bring that together? Now, of course, another thing was we wanted to make this application public domain, so anyone could pick it up without any knowledge of our software or the Microsoft software. Now, for that to happen, obviously the data updates need to be fully automated. So we had to make sure that whatever we take from external data just happens. And if you load up the data tomorrow, it just happens. You don't have to worry about how you do that or have any knowledge on how to do that. And last but not least, you think, well, okay, once you've built it, it's done, just runs, doesn't it? And you perhaps like to think that is the case with your own apps, but actually it doesn't. And the reason why it doesn't is like in your own applications, things change. We've only been testing this data for about a month, and during that time, it's changed 3 times from the providers we're getting it from. And even things that just totally break the application. So it's not a job done, we just roll it out and away we go. We have to keep on top of this every day to make sure you get a trouble-free application. So what are the requirements? We wondered about keeping it close to home and just doing an app that monitored COVID in the UK. But we decided in the end that we wanted a broader spectrum and allow you to contrast the UK with other countries. So we developed a worldwide application where we're bringing in about 100,000 as of the end of May, 100,000 rows of data, and of course that will increase as we go forward. And we wanted that to be available from anywhere using any device. So whether it's your iOS or Android phone or tablet, desktop PC or a laptop, all of those should work. And we wanted to use the latest Microsoft Business Intelligence technology. So we're using Power BI for the dashboards. And we also thought we could do a companion app using Excel 365. And for those of you interested in looking at that from a reporting point of view, you can actually download the Excel 365 app from within inside the Power BI application. There's a little icon on there that I'll show you in another video. Now, of course, we don't have the data ourselves, so we need reliable and reputable data coming in from external data providers. And we obviously have to accept that we need to update that information several times a day. Now, certainly with one of the data providers, it's a continual update, but we don't do that here. We actually schedule our app to update about 4 times a day to make sure we get in the data in from the different continents. And that leads us to the next challenge, is how do we provide flexible comparisons between continents, countries and provinces, because one of the other issues we face are things are called different in different places, and not only are they called different things, but they might roll up, countries might roll up to continents in a slightly different way from one data feed to another. So again, real world issues that you'll have to get to grips with if you were doing this on sales data using products, regions, SKUs, whatever. And we decided that we needed to get more than one data source because we wanted a wide enough information set where you could do things like here and now, and you could also trend the data over days, weeks, months, even potentially years, heaven forbid if it goes forward that far, so that you can see if things are getting better, worse in different areas. Now, we also had to introduce another data source that we created from the ground up. And that was to ensure that when we looked at that particular country, I mentioned the US earlier on, then how do we make sure that if I take the data from one source and do a report and say, give me all the information I have on the USA, that I don't just get half the information. And if I then say, give me all the information on the US, I get the other half of the information. So the only way to do that, because we don't control the data sources, is to have a mapping spreadsheet that we can then actually define those relationships. So that by the time it comes together in the application, it's already mapped into a common set of hierarchies. So where do we get the data from? Two really, worldometers. Why did we choose them? Because they had very current data. The great thing I like about Worldometer is they update their data continuously. So first thing in the morning, they're getting in data from Australasia. Last thing in the afternoon, they're completing the data load for Europe and then moving on to North America. So their information is bang up to date. But, and here is a but, they only provide information for today and yesterday at any point in time. So we can't go back 3 weeks and say, if I look at the last 21 days, what did the trends like? Are the deaths getting worse? Are the recoveries getting better? No option of doing that. So for that, we went to another data provider, the Humanitarian Data Exchange. And the great thing about them, data is available since 1st of Jan, but their data is always at best as of yesterday. So we're 1 day behind when we're looking at trends. So obviously by putting those two things together, we get the best of both worlds. We get the instant here and now comparisons, and we get the trends to see how things are developing. Now, of course, the challenge that we have and you would have with your apps is how do you keep those in sync from a user's perspective and ensure that people know exactly the periodicity of the data and the mapping of the data. And also, how do we bring in extra information to allow us to map that data consistently? You know, one of the best ways of displaying data for a worldwide app is obviously to have little heat maps on actual maps themselves, because it's obvious to everyone from a navigation point of view. But just having the names of countries in the data doesn't guarantee that. So we need to make sure that we have additional data in there, and typically most software products use long and lat codes so that we can accurately map the data, not only together from the different data sources, but also from a mapping perspective in the actual reports and analyses. So we load this data in, we merge the data together, and then we have our own separate spreadsheet that allows us to remove the anomalies. So we don't want to have this US and USA type anomaly. And we also then roll up that data from the base countries that we get in these two data sources into continents. And we also roll it down. In one of the data sources, we get a breakdown of the country into province or districts. So I can break down Australia, for example, into New South Wales, Queensland, and so forth. And also we have to look at the context of the data and be able to explain that to the end users. Now, it's not a surprise that when I drill down on continent, I would expect the UK to be under Europe. So the first continent I drilled down, just as a test, was South America. I was quite horrified to see the UK was in South America. So that's obviously wrong, isn't it? Well, actually it wasn't, because these hierarchies are based on sovereignty. So when I drill down from South America, I do get the UK, because when I drill down on the UK, I get the Falkland Islands in that context. Obviously, if I drill down on Europe and get the UK, I will get England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, which is probably what I expected, but also other areas that I didn't even know, to be honest, was included in the UK, like the Isle of Man and Gibraltar. So again, starting to unravel some of the other things that perhaps we didn't realize when we just hear the stats for a particular country. And then obviously we look at what are the common metrics across the two, because there are different metrics, which is good because it allows us to actually show things in a different way. So for example, in the Worldometer data, we have things like deaths per million population for each country. We don't actually have that in the HDX data. And of course the technical challenges here, now flipping away from information mode, is how do we provide consistency here? Because I wanted to develop an app that exists in Microsoft's Excel and Power BI. And for those of you who are more technically minded, you would know that both of those have a thing called Power Query in there that allows it now for desktop products to import vast quantities of data. We import, as I said, about 100,000 rows here, which you couldn't really normally do in a spreadsheet. But unfortunately, there are differences between the things. Although Power Query is Power Query, it's not. There are differences in Excel and Power BI that we had to be cognizant of when building the application. And then we get on to data integrity. And I'll talk about this in a second. Just before I leave actually the previous one on data validation, if I just go through and actually quick ping across to the spreadsheet that we created. This is what we also use now to map the data from hum data and worldometers into a common format. So we have the worldometer and hum data countries as they define them on these first two columns, and then we map those to one consistent way of how we're going to refer to the data in the application and how we're going to roll that up to its parent, which in this case is the continent, and we've defined the continents in this spreadsheet. And last but not least, if we're getting data for individual countries, what is the longitude and latitude of that country? Because if I store that in this spreadsheet and then I merge that with the other two data sources, then I can accurately graph that information and make sure the bubbles of information come across against the right countries. So that's how we actually do that. Okay, so going back to the presentation then, we then have to start looking at the data integrity. And even that is a challenge that you need to think about. Because if we take the different continents, obviously as you'd expect, they update at very different times. If I look at this application at 7 in the morning, which I tend to UK time, then the only difference between yesterday and today's data is really Australia and New Zealand. That's the only real difference. But once I look at Europe in the afternoon, I then need to be cognizant that perhaps at 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, then I've got most of the European information in. The UK tends to report somewhere between 4 and 4:30. But I also need to be cognizant the other day, because if I'm only looking at today and yesterday's data, unfortunately, at 1 minute past 3 UK time, then the data for Australia actually becomes yesterday's data, because it's now 12:01 AM in Australia. So we've got this information constantly moving, and it's very hard to just pin that at one point in time using the way it's stored in worldometers here. And we also have to look at what are people reporting, and before we make any business judgments on the data, I know we're not making a business judgment with COVID, but before we even make any assumptions, and let's be honest, there are a lot of assumptions, good and bad, being made out there, we need to understand that things are different. You know, the UK, the US, China all report information slightly differently. Is a death a death? And that sounds daft thing to say, but is it? Even in the UK, a death is certainly not a death. If I look at the data in February for the UK, and of course I wouldn't necessarily know this, that was actually only hospital deaths. This was only COVID deaths that were caused in hospital. But if I look in deaths April onwards, then in the UK sense, we are actually adding to that hospital deaths plus care home deaths. Now, that's fine because we didn't store the care home deaths before that date. But it can be misleading. Imagine if I was looking at a trend and I say, show me the days from February through to April, then I might see a massive increase in April that really isn't the massive increase it seems, because the fact that we didn't have the care home deaths in the data before made it look a much steeper spike than it actually was. And we also need to question, perhaps with some countries, the reliability and even honesty of that. I know that in South Africa they are suffering real hardship and have a lot of deaths, yet if you look at the numbers, there are very, very few indeed. And if we look at China, we know how prolific the COVID virus is, but it didn't spread anywhere, and there was actually no instances whatsoever in the capital. And you've got to ask yourself, I guess, is that true? And when you're preparing statistical analysis, are you going to make some assumptions on that data? And last but not least, I mentioned earlier on the definitions between the three main metrics we're using in this app: the total number of COVID cases, the total of deaths caused by COVID, and the total recoveries happening. They could be very different per country. Now, I'm not saying there's a magical solution to this. There isn't, but you need to have that in your mind, particularly when you transfer this to perhaps a business application where you might have similar anomalies, that different things happen in different countries. Well, you need to bear that in mind if, for example, you're looking at restructuring your operations and thinking that country is performing well and that country is really performing badly. Well, are you comparing them on a like-for-like basis, even though you're taking the same data? And then we get on to automation. We're saying obviously that this app just has to run. If you run the app and you save it in your browser and you open it up tomorrow, then you would rightly expect to see the new information. Now, behind the scenes, we obviously have to make sure that happens, and we import the data continuously from the two different data sources. We mash that together with our mappings for continents, and then we update that information several times a day. And for us to do that in Power BI, we have to have a link from the model on one of our local PCs, and that updates the actual application that's on the web. Now, again, don't want to get too technical for those of you not interested in the technology, but for those of you who are, we're using the Power BI personal gateway to sync the application data from the desktop up to the service, and we do that 4 times a day. Now, we've taken a slightly different approach with the Excel companion app, because not so many people perhaps download this, and we do that every time you open the app up. So as soon as you open an Excel workbook like any other workbook, what will happen here first of all is it will recognize that the data is coming from external sources, and it will go away and update that information. And if you look at how that is done, if I look at the Power BI refresh, here are the scheduling that we run on the web server, where we tell it the times during the day to update, and we get an update full history from Power BI on whether those updates have succeeded or failed. They tend to only fail for 1 or 2 reasons. Either we've switched the PC off that's got the application, which is an obvious one. I guess you would tend to do that in a server in your environment, so you wouldn't have that happening. Or we've had a failure, which 9 times out of 10 is caused by the underlying data vendor changing the structure in the file, or even putting stuff in the file that shouldn't be in there. Classic case being putting text in a numerical field. So we're saying, okay, number of deaths is purely numeric for each country, and someone keys in TWO. Well, then obviously we're not going to be able to process that. Okay, so the summary was, we thought originally we would knock this up really, really quickly in a couple of days and just show what we could do, and hopefully give you an app where you can monitor the COVID-19 virus. Turns out it's really a full-blown business intelligence application, albeit we've cut corners along the way. And all the considerations that you're going to need for your applications are applicable here. We had to go through, okay, what are we trying to do in the first place? What are our goals or objectives? Where do we get the information from? If it's from more than one data source, which it is, it's effectively from 3 data sources here, 2 with data, 1 that we've introduced that provide the mappings between the countries and continents. Is all the data there? What is the quality like of the data? Can we do anything to improve the quality of the data? And how do we then interpret that data? Are we comparing like with like across the whole, every single country in the world? And if not, is there any compensation we can do? And once we've done all that and got all the information together, then we need to develop the app itself. Now, if you were doing this, there would be a separate stage here for defining the reports and dashboards that you want to do. But we've been doing this for 20 years on over 600 applications. So we kind of knew that once we got the data together, we kind of knew what reports we were going to need and the sort of things we were going to do. Once we have the app, then we don't want people having to look after and manually update this every 5 minutes, so we need to automate it, which we've done using Power BI and Excel 365 functionality. And last but not least, we obviously need to package the app in a way that's very easy to access and use by yourselves. And we start doing things like this video here that provides some documentation on how we've done it and why we've done it. So lessons learned, and this is a lesson, I guess, for us, even despite our experience, and indeed for you when you're approaching your applications. Simple doesn't exist when. And simple doesn't exist when certainly you don't control the data. If you control all the data, you can ensure the data is formatted consistently. If you've got multiple data sources and you control those, then you can ensure that USA is USA. You don't have to map US and USA to one USA. You just know it's going to be the same because you control it. But if you don't have that control. You need to put in extra processes. And you want the final user experience to be a completely out of the box journey. You don't want people scrapping around trying to find out how to use the software. It should be fairly obvious how you drill down, either using maps or little plus signs from, say, continents to countries to provinces. And you want everything completely bulletproof. You don't want obviously crashes happening in the thing, so you need to obviously test that application in the same way we would test your application. And then when you're looking at providing a combination of technologies, here we are using Power BI for the web-based and mobile dashboards, and we're using Excel on the desktop if you want to get into the data in a bit more detail. So that's it. I hope you download the Excel app, and I hope you use our Power BI app online. How do you get access to those? Well, the fact you've got to this page and got to this video means you've probably been through the registration. But as soon as you register, you will get access to this web-based application on COVID-19 that can be accessed from any browser on a mobile or PC or Mac device. And from within that application, you will see that there's a little icon to the far right there that says Get Excel Companion App. Once you select that, it will take you off to a site that allows you to download the file. When you open up that file, it will then take you into Excel, and then you'll have a similar Excel model here where you can do additional things from a reporting perspective. And I'll cover that in the next few videos on how you can actually use the information within those two apps. Thank you.